Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. On December 4th, 1909, the Montreal Canadiens were founded by J. Ambrose O'Brien as a charter member of the National Hockey Association, the forerunner to the NHL. However, this was not the only important event in Canadian sports history on this day. The other, it has to do with football and something known as the Grey Cup.
Welcome to the Football History Dude Podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time as we step out the DeLorean, the date is December 4th, 1909 at Rosedale Field, a grandstand in Rosedale Park at 20 Schofield Avenue in Toronto, Ontario, which is in Canada. We are here to watch a football game between the University of Toronto Varsity Blues and the Toronto Parkdale Canoe Club. Now, depending on your style, you may be telling me that I'm crazy talking about football on this day because if you're an NHL fan, something more important happened. The Montreal Canadiens were formed. Now, I don't know a whole lot about hockey, but if you're just talking championships, the Canadiens have won 23 Stanley Cups. The next team, the Toronto Maple Leafs, with 13. 10 less than the Montreal Canadiens. So, I think that's pretty good. But instead, we are still going to stick over here in the city of Toronto. See what I did there? Little transition. Oh yeah, but first, the only pro team in the major North American sports that has more championships than the Canadiens is the New York Yankees. But Toronto, back to Rosedale Field, December 4th, 1909. This game is significant because it's the first ever Grey Cup championship game. This Grey Cup, that's the trophy that is given to the champion of the Canadian Football League to this day. Yes, a championship trophy that was originally given out before the NFL even existed. Well, not even then did it exist because it was a couple years later they get changed to the NFL. But with that said, you're going to hear a theme throughout this episode describing my, well, we'll call it being a little naive. Focusing so much of my time on the National Football League, which, by the way, I still think is the greatest league on this planet. But then again, I'm biased. I get that. I've grown up an NFL fan my whole life. However, through listening to partner shows on the Sports History Network and researching other sports of various topics for myself, including the show, I also realized that there's so much more out there to know about, and it is also fascinating how similar, yet how far apart we can be on things, including sports. I mean, dang, American football is still a toddler compared to some sports and how long they've been out there. I mean, baby, I guess, for others. Take horse racing, for instance. This has gone on millennia. But in my research, it appears that something called the Carlisle Bells are the oldest known sporting trophy still in existence in the world. These are something that were awarded back in the 16th century for something called the Carlisle Bell, a historic British flat horse race. And that is one reason why I brought Oz Davis on this show as my guest for this episode. His podcast, Truly the Goats, takes a look at sports from all of human history, not just the ones that we watch today. I mean, for instance, one of the episodes covered on GOAT of sumo wrestling, and another was the GOAT gladiator. I mean, we're talking thousands of years of history there. Don't worry, the reason why I talked to Oz for this episode primarily falls on the history of the Canadian Football League, so we're going to keep it with the theme of football. You know, this is the Football History Dude podcast, by the way. Now, the Canadian Football League, the CFL, this is something that you might be familiar with. Or you may be like me and quote-unquote be football shamed into not knowing much about the league. I joke about this because there's a spot in here where I straight up says, okay, I'm going to have to football shame you here. Because, I don't know much about the CFL, and he's right. A league, well, the league itself might not be older than the NFL, but the trophy was in existence before the NFL was even born. So, let's just say I have a lot to learn about other football leagues, including the NCAA, than what I know about the NFL and the history of the NFL. The NFL will still be my focal point here, but like I said, I'd like to get to know more about the CFL, the NCAA, and the other leagues that are out there, most that are not in existence anymore, because everything evolves and feeds off of each other in a way to create the varying leagues that we all love. And if you're like me, I think you're going to go ahead and enjoy this episode because it's definitely different and it's going to explore beyond our normal territory of the NFL. But first things first, I'm going to peel back that big old curtain again to let you know that this is the second recording that Oz and I had, because the first one, I don't know, must have been zapped by that lightning bolt back in 1955 when Dr. Emmett Brown was floating in the sky and he got zapped back to 1885. So what I'm saying is you're going to hear a few references in there about, that other interview we had, or, like I said before, I'm not sure if I talked about this in the last time, but that is why, because this is the second, take two, if you will. Hopefully the sequel is better than the first, the original, as some people say never can happen. I don't know. So with that, we kick this interview off by talking to Oz about the current news of the XFL and CFL merger, and then into what we are going to discuss, the Canadian Football League history. Starting in 3, 2, 1, here we go. Let's just get into it. Let's get with the topic at hand, originally why I brought you in. Let's give me an update 2.0 on the XFL CFL merger news.
There is an update 2.0. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about this on the Sports History Network Showcase. Maybe before this podcast is launched, or maybe after, I'm not sure, with Greg James of From the 55-Yard Line, a new show here at the Sports History Network. How do you like that? How do you like these plugs, huh?
Perfect little transition, yeah.
For other SHN shows. In any case, okay, so let's talk about it because the commissioner just came out late last week on 4/20. I don't know if that's significant. And told us that, yes, we will have a season. It will start in August. It will be 14 games rather than 18. It may be a situation where the first 3 to 4 weeks of the season are played in the Western provinces, where I guess COVID is more under control than in the East, than in your Torontos and Ottawas and Montreals and whatnot. So imagine that out there on the prairie. There's less spread. The other one is that the Grey Cup is going to be played in mid-December. I think the actual date was December 12th. And typically that's played at the end of November. So it'll just make it that much colder. Like I was saying to Greg, it's a good thing it's in Hamilton and not, say, Calgary or Edmonton, where it would be even freaking colder. But, okay. So, I don't know. Where would you like me to go with this? Because there's many ways to go with that.
We could go anywhere, but so you mentioned Grey Cup. Thankfully, it's in Hamilton. So is it like the Super Bowl? It's a neutral site now every year?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Has it been like that for like quite some time?
Oh, yeah.
Or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think that has been the tradition since the CFL was actually formed in like 1949, I think. But a couple of years, they did the weird 1-1 aggregate score thing, which is really weird. So you play 2 games, and they each get a home game. And then if it's split, which you expect it will be, then they just total up the points. So you could lose.
Didn't you bring that up in the Mazda episode?
Yeah. I think he was in a couple of
Okay.
those. Or he came in just as that was ending. That would have been in like 57, I think, if I remember correctly. So
I feel like I've heard that before, and it must have been on it was number 3, the Truly the Goats, Mosca.
yes, three or four. Yeah.
I think it was a two-parter, 3 and 4.
Oh yeah, I had so much material for that one. It was just what a master. So okay, so now the catch-22s. I mean, I shouldn't say the catch-22s, but the issues are still here. He basically admitted that he doesn't know exactly how the schedule is going to play out in August. The very puffy statement was that we have, the teams are committed to being innovative with getting in these 14 games and stuff like this. This is a problem. Another problem is this. In the past few years before COVID, the CFL was getting a bit of a bump, because they used to start the season in June. And guess what? Gambling is becoming legal in the U.S. Fantasy football is an obsession in the U.S. And so the CFL was soaking in like the hardcores for 2 months of the year. While there was no football going on. There wasn't even college or high school ball going on in June and July. But the CFL has ruined this. And again, I don't know if at this point in the podcast I've already talked about it or not, but the biggest weakness of the CFL and what the CFL XFL deal is really about is trying to get those TV bucks. And I mean, essentially now they're going head on with the NFL. They're going to lose the ratings war in places like Toronto. If they choose to like the Buffalo Bills, if they choose to play the games on Sunday, which they probably won't, they got to be at least smart in that respect and just not literally go head to head with the NFL. But they're not going to get 10% of the attention they got from the U.S. these past few years because of this schedule change. That's a minus. And again, like I say, we don't know. Odds are they will pull off 14 games somehow. I mean, if the NFL could do it, and if baseball could figure out a way to get in 60 games with their free-for-all system, quote unquote, I'm sure the CFL can knock down 14 games. But again, there's additional problems here too. Like, is Canada going to start letting Americans back in? I mean, they're not going to make special exception because they're football players. And, that's 50, 60% of the league of the Americans, right? I heard a rumor. I don't know if it was true, but I heard a rumor that San Antonio has volunteered to bubble for the CFL. So, like, if the CFL wants to do some weeks in a bubble, San Antonio is ready and willing. And sure, why not? Why not? They thought they were getting the Raiders a few years ago. So why not? They obviously have facilities. They got a lot of people. That's a big city now. So they could do it. They can do it.
Yeah, but if I'm a CFL fan and my league is heading to America, about as far south as it gets almost, it just seems, I don't know, it just seems awkward.
Well, yeah, but the central issue is that not enough people are going to the games anyway.
Yeah, that's true because the TV
especially
thing.
Right, because the TV thing. And, that's the same as it is here. Again, you don't want to have to drive to the stadium, go through traffic. I'm in LA. Go through traffic, park for $40, buy the overpriced crap at the stadium, pay your babysitter if you got kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No, you got the comfy chair and your beer is right over here. It's at arm's length, man. Why do I need to go anywhere? I can crash when I want to. I don't have to drive. It's just like, so, I mean, it's the same problem. So they'd still have the TSN deal and everything, people would be watching. And you'd even get higher ratings in places like, Saskatchewan, because then people couldn't go to.
Yeah, they'd have to.
You'd have to watch it on TV. It's a kind of a reverse logic there. But realistically, that probably won't happen. I don't know. I'm kind of optimistic about the whole COVID thing anyway. I think by August it should be clean. Don't you think? I mean, how are you on the COVID thing?
I mean, I'm optimistic as well there, as far as everything improving. But I'm not going to really state where it's going to go, obviously. I mean, everybody, like you said, the border, that would be a big one as far as how many XFL teams would there have been?
Well, the XFL has 8 teams and the CFL has 9. So, and how many teams? This is one of the things I was talking with Greg about, and this is one of the things I've mentioned on the Rouge, White, and Blue CFL podcast too, is that the XFL isn't much more than a collection of logos and names. It really isn't. I mean, in 21 years, they have 1.5 seasons under their belt. They've produced 3 or 4 NFL players, Tommy Maddox, and who else? Maybe a couple more. I mean, this isn't the USFL. They're not producing. This isn't even the CFL. The CFL produces Hall of Fame NFL players. I mean, it's like the XFL is nothing but a brand. It's nothing but a logo and The Rock.
Yeah, and I don't even know, again, how much involvement there is. I stick more to the NFL, like you said, 21 years and only 1.5 seasons. But it's funny because I still know what the XFL, I know more about the XFL probably, even though it's only been that one season than the CFL, which is crazy to think. You know what I mean?
Shame. I'm going to football shame you, man. I'm going to football shame you. The CFL it's a superior brand of football. It is a little bit different. I really consider it a different sport. I mean, basically, if okay, like I've been doing for an upcoming episode of Truly the Goats. Hey, yet another reference to a Sports History Network podcast. I'm talking about the Gaelic games. Okay, there's a couple of proper Gaelic sports. Now, one of these is Gaelic football. But guess what? It's similar enough to Australian rules football that there is a common game that if the teams want to play against each other, they can play with these neutral rules. Okay, so if these two sports can be considered different games, Canadian football is a different game, okay, than American football. The big one is the big rule difference is 3 downs versus 4. That's a big one. Another big one, the big ones for me, and of course, what the CFL fans are really worried about is when this merger or this connection happens, the CFL rules disappear. And the 2 big ones for me are the neutral zone is a yard wide, right? So you're lining up a yard off the other line. And you have unlimited motion before the snap, right? Those are the 2 things that really do it for me. It generally increases offense because, this is how a guy like Doug Flutie, who is undersized for the NFL, even in the 80s or whatever, succeeds in the CFL into the 90s, is just because he has that extra space that he can see. You have more time to react. It's also built for a more athletic player. The thing about the NFL game and even the college football game, really any level of American football now, is that everybody's so much bigger, right? Everybody's so much stronger. Everybody's so much faster, right? It's a game built for a different size of man than those who are currently playing it. So to be an offensive lineman, you need to have good footwork, right? But you don't necessarily have to be super athletic. Whereas in the CFL, you're moving. You got that 1 yard. You're pushing forward. You're not just, holding the guy off. There's line play is different. Line play is completely different. And since line play is so much a part of football, again, you have to consider it a different game. So, and then there's a couple of other rules that the XFL already uses. The no fair catch. So you have to give the receiver of a punt or a kick the 5-yard radius, or I think it's 5 yard radius, right? You have to give them a little circle but there's no fair catch, right? So as soon as he catches it, you can just annihilate him, like you used to be able to do in the NFL, just not at full speed, right? Which is what causes, ridiculous traumatic injuries on special teams. So that's a difference. You also have this neat rule called the Rouge, which I'm sure is an extinct species, but actually some American football teams, before the rules were really codified, used to play with the rule, which is like so when you kick a field goal or an extra point, that ball is live, right? So if you miss it, the opposition gets to return it, right? If it bounces out of the end zone, or if the runner gets tackled in the end zone, or the receiver, I should say, gets tackled in the end zone, that's a point. That's called a Rouge. It's like a bonus point for the special teams, right? But that rule is probably extinct now if the CFL merges with the XFL. There's a few other ones. I believe it's just 1 foot in bounds on the catch. I believe. The clock stops in the final 2 or 3 minutes of the game after every first down. That's like a college rule, right? That's the same as in college. Couple other ones. Challenge rules are different, but this isn't really part of football anyway. This is part of football on TV.
So that Rouge you're talking about, and you mentioned that last time that we got together. You said that if they kick it if it bounces and it goes out of bounds, then that could be a point for the kicker?
I believe so, yeah, for the kicking team.
So even if it's like way wide left or wide right or something like that?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, I believe so. I have to check for sure. I'm drawing a blank right now, but I'm pretty sure.
Right, yeah, but something totally different than what I'm used to. I mean, like you said, in the NFL, sure, they can the defense can receive it and then they can run for it, but I've never heard of the offense being able to miss and then still being able to score points. It seems like it'd be more interesting for special teams plays.
Well, yeah, that's the argument against it, right? The argument against it is like you're rewarding failure. But I tend to think of it as you're rewarding success on special teams. Let's see. I'm going to take a look at this here. Then the ball's kicked into and through the end zone. Yeah. Okay. So you can. Yeah. You can just kick it out.
Huh. I wonder, have they ever tried something like that on purpose then? Is that like a strategy from a real far away field goal where they would try to kick it maybe to the corner?
Yeah, you see that. But what tends to happen more, and there's some killer YouTubes about this, is there are rules in the CFL where, and again, this harkens back to stuff like rugby, where, like, let's say there's no time left, okay, and a team is kicking off, right? And so, in the US, you'll have a situation where, you'll just try and lateral play it. You'll do the rugby passes and you'll try and, get an end around and score. Okay. Well, in the CFL, what happens is you start kicking, right? Because anybody can become a punter and kick the ball, right? Now that's a live ball. Right. So you kick it downfield, your own guy can get it. And so what usually happens is the response is the other team kicks it back. So again, it starts to look like, a sort of Gaelic football game at the end. It turns into this human ping pong. Like the massive lateral play. It rarely works. But there are some times when it gets so close. It's sweet. Like I say, there are some killer videos of this on YouTube. Just look up anything like crazy ending to CFL game or wild ending to CFL game. And yeah, it'll be one of those plays.
No, that does sound like it. I mean, I'm thinking of like old backyard style. We'd play like Air Force football, we'd always call it. You could throw it or kick it back and forth. As opposed to the NFL, nice. You have to only go lateral. Huh, yeah, that's interesting. Another rule that to me seems foreign. I mean, in our last interview, I told you I'm the stereotypical American. I only know my sport and my sport's superior. And obviously I don't believe that, especially when I'm able to be educated on other sports and other country sports of the same type of sport too.
Well, as you dive, one of the mind blowers for me about doing sports history podcasting is all this stuff that we take for granted now, right? If you go back to before 1920, before 1900, right? You just go back far enough. Go back to the first Thanksgiving Day game, okay? And soon you realize that football, soccer, right? Association football, gridiron football, which it wasn't in the 19th century, and rugby football are all one and the same. It's like a fluid continuum, right? And in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, that's when, especially folks in England, got obsessed about codifying stuff, right? They're like, no, we're not going to have it where the home team gets to choose the rules. No, we're going to make the 11 rules of soccer, right? And then later on, at rugby college or whatever, they codified the fact that you could pick the ball up, and run with it, and like that. And so that's what's wild, especially about football, is that, again, at one time there was this sport that was soccer / rugby / football / Gaelic football / Australian rules, whatever else you want to put in there. And it's wild to think about it. Before that, I mean, this is medieval towns in Europe kicking a sheep bladder from one end of town to the other. I mean, it's wild. It's wild to think about it. And it's kind of like evolution. Canadian football and rugby are the evolutionary cousins of football. Now that the ancestor is gone, it's just wild to get some perspective on that in history.
Yeah, and you've traveled across the world too. Has there been any other sports that are similar, yet they have their own, I guess, regional rules that kind of were different?
Well, I mean, do you mean in football or just in the?
I guess it'd be like it'd probably be more the rugby soccer space, not necessarily the American football space.
Oh, sure. There's more variance on it, I'm sure. Because so rugby has a variant as well. And I forget how that works. Traditional rugby is up to 12 guys on a side now. And they play another version with like 7 or 8 guys on a side. So I guess that's kind of comparable to the slim down football that they play in Texas, 7-man football or whatever they call it. But see, I consider those different games too. I consider Arena League a different game too. I mean, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's some similarities, but yeah, definitely different. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's as distinct as futsal, which is that indoor soccer game, is to soccer, proper, field soccer. It's a different game. But yeah, there's a lot of different variants that come off of soccer, and thus, football. But the one that I always think of when you think of a continuum of sports is wrestling, right? Not every, but many, many, many major cultures come up with wrestling. It's just that the rules are all different. Everybody just makes up different rules. And so you have something like there's a form of wrestling in Native America where you stand and you place the insoles of opposite feet together on one side. And then, so you're standing in a V facing each other. And then you grab hands and then you try and shove the other guy off balance. And they call this wrestling. So it's kind of like arm wrestling, except with no table. It's basically what they're doing. They're basically doing arm wrestling with no table. And they call that wrestling. And then you get sumo wrestling, which looks a lot like the Canadian Football League Lions. Because you got 2 guys that are about 3 feet apart just smacking into each other. So, and these are both called wrestling. So, the continuum of sport is just friggin' amazing once you start getting into sports history. But, this, you're a geek.
Right. I mean, especially for you going back to all the varying sports with the Truly the Goats. You keep bringing up your future episode, Gaelic football. How long ago was the roots, I guess you could say, for that?
Gaelic football, not too long, right? Because again, it's a deliberate spin-off from, again, when that solar system of soccer football is forming. It's one of those that spins off. What they did is they took the hurling field, right? Hurling is kind of, what is it? It's a cross between field hockey and murder is the famous line. But yeah, so they took that field and adapted soccer for it. And I think that they play with like 15 players is another difference. But I mean, it's an interesting sport because you could almost consider it an artificial sport where, again, it's kind of like indoor football to me. Arena football is an artificial sport, right? You're forcing this one game into the confines of another pitch and, distorting it in that way. But see but the rules now have evolved so differently that, it's a distinct game. Like I say, it's as distinct from rugby as is Australian rules football.
Yeah, again, we could go on and on about all the different sports out there. And I guess as a host, it's my duty to bring us back now to football, Americanized football. But then let's go back to CFL. Is there a Walter Camp of the CFL, like someone that's known to be the founder of that type of rule set?
Oh, wow. I'm sure there is, but I'm limited in this respect. I'll find out because Canada is a very strange situation in general. I mean, remember that until what was it? 1869, it was still part of Britain. Okay, so things evolved a little more slowly out there. Plus, it wasn't like the U.S. Travel across the Canada wasn't as easy as across the U.S. for various reasons. Railroad system wasn't as good, but also the winters are insane. It's just hard to traverse that, right? So you had a situation for the first 50 or 60 years of the Canadian Rugby Union, right? Where, again, like different provinces even would have different rules, right? They would have, and again, it was the kind of thing where on the rare occasions when, the Quebec team came to, I don't know, Manitoba or something, and they played a game there, you'd go home team rules. So, but then, gradually through time, the thing is, the reason why, for example, the CFL has a West and an East right now is because up until 1950, literally, the West was united and the East was united. And so you had 7 teams from Edmonton or whatever. It's kind of like a situation of American football before the NFL, right? Where you'd have these regional leagues. You'd have the Ohio League and Canton would just play all the teams from Ohio and crush them all. So it was the same thing in Canada. Slowly got to that point where the West was united and the East was united, and then the CFL just united them both.
Well, that's a good spot for halftime and a good opportunity to tell you about our first CFL podcast on the Sports History Network called From the 55-Yard Line. To learn more about the hosts and From the 55-Yard Line, you can head to the SHN Showcase podcast with Oz and the From the 55-Yard Gang to learn more. And here's the trailer for that show.
Professional football in North America, be it from the 50 or 55-yard line, is a special, unique, and rare game. For those who have played it, make it so. The heroes of the game, which recalls for many the glory of youth, for the true fan remain timeless, ageless, and forever part of a story that began long ago. For their stories are legends in which they found in the sport a demanding measure of their courage and ability, the achievements of which remain forever enshrined in the words of the researchers, historians, and sports writers, without whom their stories could not be told. Join with Scott and Greg from their 55-yard line perch and the Sports History Network on a discussion of professional football today as seen through the lens of a time where we got our news from Cronkite and Cosell, and when the game was filled with magic and wonder, where the heroes of youth, with names like Unitas, Stabler, Jackson, Greasy, Lancaster, Holloway, Staubach, Moon, and Bradshaw, played before us on old cathode ray screens and in ancient stadiums now long gone, but never forgotten.
Right, yeah. So, anyway, let's go back to, so speaking of the differences of the CFL and the NFL, or maybe other types of sports that are around football, in our last episode that we discussed, you brought up some cool CFL history. Let's kind of just maybe a brief overview, however you can, from the beginning to the end or now, or however you want to go about it.
Well, I mean, I just did a bunch of it. Okay, so that's basically how it happens. Again, like in the beginning, in the 1870s, 1880s, they're playing sort of weird rugby version, very British, very British style rules, and like that comes in. Same kind of thing is happening. There were games between these border teams once in a while. I mean, to this day, this is why North Dakota State ends up exporting so many of their players to Canada, is because, way, way, way back in the day, once in a while, they'd cross border and play games. These various teams. I mean, the winner of the first Grey Cup, which I believe is 1909, was to a college team, right? So again, you have the situation where most of sport is amateur, right? At least this highest level of sport. And we're not just talking about how people liked college ball more than pro ball, which was the case in the States until the 50s. We're not talking about that. We're talking about literally that's the highest form of ball. Just real quick, we were just talking about Gaelic football. One of the secrets about Gaelic football is, guess what? Those guys are amateurs. Those guys have real jobs. Okay. That's a throwback to the 19th century. The only reason why baseball is professional today is because there were a bunch of guys like Spalding, that got together and said, hey, maybe we should make some money off this baseball thing, and they formed the first professional sports team in probably North America. It would certainly have to be the first professional sports team. So in any case, okay. So, and then, so in the 1910s, in the 20s, and the 30s and whatnot, you're getting the forward pass. You're learning, the new formations and whatnot. There's some crossover. But the real boom time for the CFL is right after the war, 50s, 60s, whatnot. Several reasons why. One is because the Canadian dollar was about as good as the U.S. dollar. Second of all, and I talked with this on another podcast. This is great. I'm doing so many podcasts now that I forget who I'm talking to. The NFL for a long time after the war they were disproportionate. There wasn't enough teams, right? Just like in baseball, there was too much talent out there. This is why the AFL succeeded, right? Because you did have enough top level talent to fill out another 10, 12 teams. Okay. So, this is what's happening in Canada. Okay. There's no, they open it up in Canada. So there's no ratio at this time. And so anybody can come. Plus, there were a lot of guys who, let's not put too fine a point on it, felt like the racial situation in Canada might be better than it was in the U.S., because the NFL was only integrated in 40, right around the time of Jack. So
it was like a year or two before.
Yes, the Rams.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so at that was really the golden age. This is when you had Angelo Mosca. This is when you had guys like Joe Kapp, who later on became the first. I think he's still the only quarterback to start the Rose Bowl, the Grey Cup, and the Super Bowl. So pretty big name there. And a lot of other of these ex-Notre Dame players and, even future NFL Hall of Famers were playing in the CFL in the 50s and 60s. After this, America got a bit richer. The 70s was kind of weird because there was a lot of inflation going on, but sports were drawing in more and more money. It cannot really be underestimated how much not only the merger, but the subsequent Monday Night Football deal and the subsequent Sunday afternoon deals that the league made for TV. Hey, it all comes back to TV, right? That cannot be underestimated. A lot more money, a lot more interest in America, a lot more Americans going to stay home. However, in the 70s, and we tend to forget this, but the 70s was a great era for spectator sport in terms of, man, you could sell out some stadiums. You could sell out 100,000 in Los Angeles Coliseum in those days. Again, it's just more convenient nowadays. And of course, it's a lot pricier nowadays. So we don't get that. And so this was happening in the CFL. Montreal, they're getting 55,000 people for a game. Stuff like this. Toronto, it's just absolutely packing them in. The Prime Minister, Trudeau, the first, Trudeau Sr., said to be the most popular politician in the 20th century in North America. He was a huge CFL fan. Just talk about it all the time on TV and stuff, and so, it's still a good time for the CFL. 80s, not so good. Okay. This all leads to, and I don't know why the CFL didn't choose to learn from the USFL and to some extent the WFL before it, but they decided to do the amazing Cfl USA Experiment. What had happened was that there was a team, the Sacramento Gold Miners. They were a refugee from some defunct league. I don't remember what league it was. And so they were just kind of like to the CFL, hey, we're ready to go for next season. Can we join your league? And the CFL said, sure. And, for a while it worked okay. Sacramento played with the Canadian field, which of course is 10 yards longer. Hence, from the 55-yard line, the Sports History Network podcast about the CFL. And so they were able to, they changed that. They made the field wider like it is in Canada. They were willing to do that. Okay. Floodgates are open, right? The Canadian owners are going, hey, we can charge massive franchise fees and pocket the money, right? It worked for the USFL, right? That's what killed them. So, they threw in a bunch of other teams. And, not too many of them were successful, with the exception of Baltimore. The Baltimore Stallions were legendary. This was just after Baltimore had their team stolen from them. And in fact, the first year Baltimore was in the league, they called themselves the Colts, the CFL Colts, right? But the NFL wasn't having any of that, so they made them change the name. So they changed it to the Stallions. And the first year they went to the Grey Cup, what happened was they organized the league into North and South divisions. Now, there was crossover, but the Americans refused to play by the Canadian rules. They kept their field because it was inconvenient to change the chalk lines, I guess. I think they still had 12 men and stuff like that, but they, and the big sticker was the ratio. Screw that. Nope. We're going to have 53 Americans, right? That's what they said. Now, as a result, it's still interesting because many of the teams were not very good in America anyway, except for Baltimore. So the first year Baltimore was in the league, year 2 of CFL USA, they were in the finals. They were in the Grey Cup, and they lost to, I think it was the 8-10 BC Lions. I think they were 8-10. They had a losing record that year, and but they just got on. Cup. Yeah, but they just got on a tear at the end of the season and just snuck back in because, the American teams were beating up on the Canadian teams. So there were a bunch of Canadian teams with poor records, much worse than that. So They lost to the BC Lions, but then the second year they put together what is basically thought to be the greatest CFL team ever, or top 2 or 3. Some folks in Edmonton have disputes with their Warren Moon teams, but probably one of the top 2 or 3 teams of all time, the 1995 Stallions. Just cruised. They were something like 15-3, just cruised, beat the Lions again in the Grey Cup, and that's it. That's the only American team that has ever won the Grey Cup until, I suppose, 2023, when the Houston Roughnecks are going up against the Calgary Stampeders. And since then, the other thing about the CFL USA is it was great in the short term, but just trashed them in the long term. Just trashed the league. They got themselves in a huge debt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Had a bunch of American players who were technically CFL players, but they couldn't take them all because of the ratio, stuff like this. So they moved the Baltimore team to Montreal and, ejected about 2/3 of the players because they're all American. And since then, they've kind of righted the ship until recently, sort of, taking care of physically, keeping the salaries low, unfortunately. But what are you going to do? Getting those TV deals as best they could. TSN used to pay a lot more relatively for Canadian football than they have been recently. Again, big part of the problem. And, fans would come to the games. That was the thing about CFL USA, is that with the exception of Baltimore, which was, actually the Birmingham team did pretty well too, in terms of attendance. But, CFL teams were selling out during CFL USA. It's just that the USA teams weren't selling out. They weren't making any money. So the league has to assume that debt. And so, but, people are still going to the games in the 80s and the 90s. And it's just, I don't know when things got so out of hand. I don't know when it became better to stay home. The schedule didn't change. The schedule, it's always started in June. It's always ended in November. Well, at least, past, 21st century, let's say. It hasn't changed. And now, like I've probably already mentioned, now they've got a debt, estimated around $60 million as a league. And I don't know how many tickets they're going to sell next year. I can't imagine that TSN is going to be real happy with them playing at the same time as football. I don't know. That's a history of the league.
Right. Yeah.
A few minutes.
I didn't really, like I said, I didn't really mean to say that, the end, but the way that you're describing it at the end there, it seems, unfortunately, like possibly it's going to go the wayside, like the WFL, the USFL. And that's a good transition into your one of your recent episodes.
But see, it's a different situation because the CFL is 100+ years old, history-wise. It's like 70. Okay, so 70-year-old league. That's the difference. Okay, and this is the dark side of my discoveries in sports history. Sports die. Leagues die. Leagues certainly die. We've seen it, and only the most complex of societies can afford these highly complex and expensive games. I mean, football is one hell of a complicated game, dude. I mean, think about it. Think about what you need to play football. This is always the selling point of soccer. You can play it with 2 guys and a ball. This is the selling point of basketball. You can play it by yourself. Football, especially on a high level, you're talking like 4 coaches. Let's just start there. Nowadays you've got to have the electronic equipment, right? I mean, it's complex, dude. And I mean, it's just, how long is this sustainable if you don't have a $1 billion TV deal? Even if your wages are so low like they are in the CFL. You need at least $100 million TV deal, and they're not getting it. It seems like doom and gloom. They're going to have to pull a rabbit out of there because, even you tell me that you know more about the XFL than the CFL. How are they going to sell this to the American audience, which is what is required?
Yeah, and it's crazy that I know more about it. When I say that, I guess I'm saying it tongue in cheek because, of course, I know more about the CFL, but really my limitations to the knowledge of that league end with me and you talking for 5-10 minutes possibly. You just explained to me way more than I could have even dreamed of knowing. Like I knew the Doug Flutie, I knew Warren Moon, I knew some of these other, other players, but because of, and I've seen games every now and then, maybe on B-dubs or something on the TV, and that looks interesting, but I never really realized any of the true rules, which is crazy to think. Like you said, the Grey Cup, 11 years before the NFL was even, but that's what I want to ask you, 1909 Grey Cup, and then however many years after that, so was the Grey Cup like just a bunch of regions that had teams and then they would fight for the Grey Cup, or was there a league?
Yeah, it was just the best. It was just the best of Canadian football, right? This trophy is awarded to the best team in Canada. Okay, so now you gotta remember, too, for the first 7-8 years of the NFL, they did not have a championship game. Dude, they voted who was the champion. Now, most years it was pretty obvious, right? Because you'd have one team that was undefeated, or one team that had one loss, and everybody else had two or more. Right? But they voted. See, again, it's something we take for granted. So back in these days, I'm not sure how they actually did it back in the day, but I believe that there was, like the NCAA, some kind of organizing body that, would choose it. Yeah. See, of course, yeah, it's the Canadian Rugby Union, right? So the Canadian Rugby Union is sort of like, your governing body. Right. It's a FIFA or whatever back in the day. And so basically they would just send out invitations to what they consider to be the two best teams. Kind of like, the bowl committee, nowadays or whatever. They just choose. They just, their board or whatever gets together and says, okay, these two teams are the best. And then, as I understand it, there would be occasions when one team just couldn't make the trip. They'd be like, okay, how about you? So it's almost like a NIT tournament situation. It's just like, they're not going to take their bid. Okay, do you want it? But again, taking it for granted, right? This is 1909. You don't even have radio at this point, right?
Yeah. Whoever can sell the teams the best, I guess, at that point might end up winning. Speaking of that, let's get into that. Newspapers.com. That was newspapers back then. Go ahead and tell us about newspapers.com a little bit.
Oh, you're going to let me do the plug for newspapers.com?
For sure, yes.
Oh, my God. Let me tell you about newspapers.com. Newspapers.com is probably my favorite website out there. No offense to sportshistorynetwork.com or trulythegoats.com. But it's probably my favorite website out there. And here's why. The truth is, here's my pitch. The truth is, if you're into sports history, okay, and you try and do sports history online, especially through, famous search engine, which will go unmentioned here because they have enough publicity as it is. Try and do a search. What you'll get, Wikipedia. You'll get a bunch of products on eBay if you're lucky. You'll get a couple of YouTube videos by people who generally probably know less than you do. They're probably very generalist kind of videos, at least in my experience. You're not going to get anything that A, you haven't seen before, and B, any high school student can't find. That's why you need newspapers.com. If you go to newspapers.com, they have 640 million plus pages of material for you. This comes from the US, from the UK, from Ireland, from Australia, from some other countries around the world, dating back from 1798 to 2021. You can look up stuff from papers, like I say, from all over the US, Canada, UK, and more. You get real-time reportage of how this stuff happened. You want to find out about the 1936 Berlin Olympics, what they really thought about it? Go back and use newspapers.com. It's a hell of a lot better than that search engine is. I'll tell you that. And plus, and I will say this, though. Beware. This thing, for the history buff, for the sports fan, is a rabbit hole. It is tough. Like just the other day, what did I look up? I looked up something. Oh, yes, of course. Because as part of Truly the Goats, I'm doing an alternate universe replay of the 1938 Pittsburgh Pirates, who had the sort of informal opportunity to pick up 5 key Negro League players, including Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. Okay, so I was looking up about opening day for 1938 Pittsburgh Pirates, right? What was going on? And I turned to the front page because you go to the front page of the same newspaper, and it was like Chamberlain's peace plan agreed upon. And it was all this stuff about how, the Germans have agreed to peace in our time and all this stuff. This is real-time stuff. Okay? Views like that have been wiped by the narrative. But with newspapers.com, you can see what people were really thinking at the time. You can see what people really thought about the 1919 Chicago White Sox throwing the series. Could they tell they were throwing it? Go to newspapers.com. You can check out stuff like the first Super Bowl reportage, or as they preferred to call it back then, the AFL NFL championship game. Go ahead, see what they thought. The funny thing about that game is you go to newspapers.com and you find out wasn't exactly as highly reported as it might be nowadays. For example, just a fascinating website, newspapers.com. And you can get 1 free week and help support podcasts like this one, like Truly the Goats, like From the 55-Yard Line, all the great Sports History Network podcasts by going to sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. 1 free week, help support Sports History Network. Newspapers.com, the greatest website of all time.
Perfect. Yeah, that's going to be great. I'm glad that I have you on here so you could go through that. And I'm not even going to bother with the typical advertisement that I throw in. That's the advertisement for it. Great. And then, which this will end up transitioning to. And then when I would say, okay, so speaking of the cool thing about newspapers.com, like you said, you get to go back to the primary accounts. So I probably asked you some DeLorean questions. I don't know what's recorded still. Let's give you a different one. Here's a DeLorean question. You get to go back to any point in football. Let's keep it American style football history. And you can go back with your buddy and you can go watch one game. What is it?
One game. Wow. Okay. It would really be great to see Jim Thorpe play. That would be pretty awesome. Now, you can choose. You could choose between the upset of Harvard. Now that I've heard about it, there was actually a game between the Carlisle School and West Point Army. And on that team was Dwight Eisenhower. And so Dwight and his buddy alongside him on the team decided that they were just going to beat the hell out of Thorpe because Thorpe was going to crush them, right? And of course, this is the days of two-way players, right? So they're facing them on both sides. By the end of the game, both of them had gone out. Eisenhower had broken his leg, thereby disrupting his career. And guess what? Eventually he becomes president. So it might be cool to see that game. That might be fun just for like the what if spinning off of it. You could, if you catch the DeLorean at the right moment, you could go into that alternate universe where Dwight doesn't become president. That would be a good one. I don't know. What's your choice? The Ice Bowl might be a good one if I'm dressed for it.
I was just, the Ice Bowl might be cool to go to, but you're talking to a dude, even though I live in Michigan. I'm not a cold weather guy. I know football and cold and everybody, it's, be out there in the cold, but I've appreciated the Lions having the Silver Dome and then now having Ford Field. So when I go to the games, I get to be inside the stadium. You know what? As you mentioned that, okay, so this seems not going back in history, but I want to go back to the 1996 Detroit Lions versus Jacksonville Jaguars game, their first game year in the league. The reason why I want to go back to that is my grandpa. He's not long for this planet, and I want to go back with that. It was my dad, my grandpa, my brother, myself, and that was the only game that Gramps ever went to live. They beat the Jaguars. I want to say like 44-0. It was something to nothing. And at the very end of the game, this is after Barry scores 2 touchdowns, and they pulled him in the third quarter or whatever. It's 3rd and goal. The Lions have their second or third stringers, and the Jaguars, Mark Brunell and everybody, still coming after him. And they went for it on 4th down, and the Lions shut them out. And that Silverdome Stadium just erupted. I want to go back to that game. And that's the first time I thought about the game in a long time. So thank you.
Wow. What a great choice. That's very, very, very interesting. Not a historical game, right? But just
not only historical if you're a Lions fan and you went with Gramps, and that's Gramps' only game he's ever been to. And that dude's 90 years coming up on 91. So he's been a Lions fan his whole life, but just like you talk about TV versus going to the game, like he'll see every game. Plus he'll have his radio on because it's harder to see now. So unfortunately when you see Gramps and doing this before you can actually see it on TV because the radio comes faster, it's a good thing coming. It's like, come on, Gramps. We don't get to see it. But I'm going back to that game. And speaking of that, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to skip over some of that other stuff, and we're going to get it to the end here. And I want to have you, because there's so much, we're going to have to bring you back on so we can get into whatever else, because we have so much there. Last words of wisdom for any fan that is in the similar shoes of me that doesn't know enough about the alternate leagues and alternate sports out there, and what would you give them as far as advice?
Wow. Okay. I think it's ESPN Plus is a great resource. Okay. They have your obscure sports on demand. Okay, and I don't even necessarily mean like bizarre sports. I mean like college softball, for example, which for most of the season you can't get on ESPN or ESPN2 even. They have cricket. They have rugby when it's a big competition like the World Cup. This is a good way to check out some of those games. The Irish games, I think, are going to stay a little bit inaccessible because they do a very weird thing with hurling, especially. And I believe also with Gaelic football. They'll show them on BBC. They'll show it throughout the British Isles and Ireland, right? But while the action is going on, the commentators often go into Gaelic. So they're doing the play-by-play in Gaelic. And then once the play stops or once there's a break, they'll start going, oh, yeah, that was a tremendous play or whatever. So they'll do the color in English, so that does it. That makes it a little bit less accessible. But these other sports, these other variations on sports, ESPN, ESPN Plus, like they really need the publicity, but they got all the contracts, right? Including a CFL contract. Now, a couple of years ago, before the 3 years ago, they had literally every game on ESPN, 1, 2, or 3. Before the pandemic, they had almost every game. You had to search around for it sometimes, and sometimes it would get preempted by like college basketball or something, but you can still catch it on the replay. So that's a great resource. Now, the problem, of course, with following the CFL this year is that it starts in August, because every year I get to tell Americans, hey, jonesing for football yet? We're already 8 weeks into the season. We're almost halfway through. You guys haven't even started, But this year, not so easy. In general, what I say is if you want to learn more about any sport, or if you want to get into a sport, pick a team. Pick a team. Having a favorite team is a great way to learn sport because you get obsessed with your team and then you have to learn what the opposition brings every time, right? So in general, I would say that. But other than that, just pick something up. Like, look, in your case, Since the CFL is probably not going to play on Sunday if they know it's good for them, just check out a game, on a Friday, or they have Thursday Night Football, or even on a Saturday if you're not in College Bowl. They play a lot of CFL on Saturday. If you're not in College Bowl, just check out a game on Saturday. It's great stuff. And again, if you don't check out anything else, watch the Grey Cup. The Grey Cup is almost always good. You're usually getting two of the 2 or 3 best teams in Canadian football. Once in a while, 500.
8 and 10 team pops up every now and then.
Yeah. Just recently, the Calgary Stampeders, who have sort of earned a reputation as the Patriots of the CFL recently, they lost to like a 500 Argonauts team, Toronto Argonauts team, and snow all over the place. It was great. It was a great game. Even so, the Grey Cup is always worth watching. I mean, it's the top of any competition, right? Like I feel like even if you don't give a damn about soccer, you got to watch the World Cup final. I mean, come on, man. Come on. Even if you don't give a damn about like gymnastics, check out the Olympic gymnastics final. I mean, it's great. I mean, so if worse comes to worse, check out the Grey Cup. Check out the Grey Cup. In the case of Canadian football or the championship.
There you go. Some CFL history for you and some overall sports history in general. Again, I'm glad that we were able to have someone like Oz Davis on this show who, as you could tell, obviously has a passion for all sports, and he seems to not have his blinders on as much as someone like yours truly about all the sports of the world. As I'm saying this, I can't remember now if I mentioned it in the interview or the mysterious Lost interview, but although I really only follow the NFL now, and speak of the NFL, tonight as I'm recording this intro, the draft is on, so we'll see what happens there. Baseball was the sport that I was the best at in school. If I had something where I potentially could have been, getting a scholarship to go to college, it would have been baseball. Then when I was younger, I played basketball in the driveway by myself and with my brother all the time. And I loved watching basketball probably mostly throughout the mid-90s. I guess there was a guy by the name of Michael Jordan and everything else around the NBA at that time. And then later on, I turned into just football, Not saying I don't like these other sports, it's just the NFL is my thing. With that being said, I think the biggest takeaway that I have is I won't say necessarily be open to more sports, because if something's on the TV at, say, Buffalo Wild Wings, no matter what the sport is, I'm definitely thoroughly entertained and engaged, because it's competition. But I think it's more to be open them, more willing to see how much each sport and league contributes to the overall sporting world. I mean, yes, NFL might be the most popular in America, but there's a lot more out there than just the NFL. And I also must admit this. I think I said the 1996 season for the Jaguars being their first, but I'm pretty sure, as I looked it up here, it's the 1995 season when the Detroit Lions played them. But yes, it was 44-0. By the way, 1995 was the year that the Lions had the most potent offense in the league. I think the first time where 2 players on the same team had over 100 receptions. Herman Moore and Brett Perriman. Then we had Johnny Morton, the Worm. Remember that guy when they took a long time to win and they go, and Jay Leno can kiss my, what, because they weren't winning too many games there. And oh yeah, there was also a guy, he wore number 20 for the Lions as well that year. But with all that, again, thank you to Oz for coming on the show. And if you like his style, I highly suggest that you check out his podcast, Truly the Goats, which you can find on the Sports History Network. The best way to find his podcast and all of our other podcasts is to head to sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.